The story begins with a young Japanese nurse, barely 20 years old, sitting in a makeshift medical station. She is injured, her uniform torn, and her sleeve bloodied. The environment is unlike anything she has experienced. A smell of disinfectant and damp canvas fills the air, and she is surrounded by other women, similarly wounded or fatigued, all in a strange and unexpected situation. The nurse had been trained under the strict codes of Bushido, the ancient Japanese warrior code, which emphasized honor and duty. As a result, she was taught to believe that surrender was a dishonorable act, worse than death itself. Her training instilled in her the belief that being captured would lead to humiliation, starvation, and torture. The nurse had braced herself for the cruelty she was told to expect from the Americans. She anticipated harsh treatment, perhaps the brutality of rifle butts, mocking laughter, and a cruel display of dominance. However, as she sat in the medical station, her reality began to contradict everything she had been taught. An American medic tended to her wound with care, his hands steady and his voice calm, as though he were treating a family member, not an enemy. His behavior was the first sign that what she had been told about the enemy was a lie. This moment marked the beginning of the nurse's internal conflict. The woman who had been prepared for brutality was now facing an unexpected and incomprehensible kindness. She realized that her perception of the war and her captors would need to be reevaluated, and this initial encounter marked the start of her deep and transformative journey. The young nurse's initial shock was profound. Instead of the anticipated violence, the American medic showed her a kindness that she had never expected from the enemy. He treated her injury with a level of care and gentleness that defied the hatred and cruelty she had been taught to associate with the Americans. His actions were not driven by disdain or victory, but by a quiet professionalism and concern for her well-being. His calm demeanor and steady hands as he wrapped her wounded arm felt foreign and unsettling to her. In that moment, the nurse was forced to confront a harsh reality. The Americans were not the monsters she had been led to believe. The nurse was not alone in her confusion. As she looked around, she saw other women, many of whom had endured similar hardships, receiving unexpected treatment. They were offered food, rich, nourishing meals, more than they had seen in days. Some were given new, clean uniforms, while others had their wounds tended to. These gestures, though simple, were deeply meaningful. The women who had feared torture and starvation found themselves not only surviving, but being treated with respect and care. For the nurse, this moment marked the first crack in the ideological walls she had built around herself. Raised in a system that revered suffering and death as the ultimate forms of devotion, she now found herself questioning everything she had been taught. The reality of the American camp was a stark contrast to the ruthless propaganda of the Japanese military. The myth of American cruelty began to crumble, replaced by a disorienting and almost unbelievable truth. She was being treated like a human being, not a pawn in a cruel game of war. The cultural shock the young nurse experienced was overwhelming. She had been raised in a system that valued sacrifice, suffering, and death for the emperor. Under the principles of Bushido, surrender was considered the ultimate dishonor, a disgrace not only to oneself, but to one's family, ancestors, and the emperor. Soldiers were taught that the enemy would show no mercy, and that capture meant inevitable humiliation, torture, and death. The nurse had internalized these beliefs, convinced that to be captured by the Americans would be the end of her dignity. However, her experience in captivity began to unravel these deeply ingrained convictions. The treatment she received from the American soldiers was not brutal. It was compassionate and humane. The guards did not mock or abuse them, but instead treated the prisoners with respect. They were fed nourishing meals, given clean clothes, and had their wounds treated by American doctors. This stark contrast to the harsh conditions she had experienced during the war and the mistreatment of Allied prisoners in Japanese camps left the nurse struggling to make sense of her new reality. For the first time, the nurse began to question the very fabric of the world she had been taught to believe in. She had grown up in a culture where her worth was measured by her loyalty to the emperor and her ability to endure pain without complaint. Now she was learning that dignity could be maintained even in captivity, that kindness was not a weakness, and that survival could be a form of respect. The dissonance between the life she had known and the kindness she was receiving in the camp was almost unbearable. It was a world turned upside down, one where mercy, rather than cruelty, prevailed. As the nurse spent more time in captivity, The myth of American cruelty, which had been ingrained in her and all those around her, began to crumble entirely. The Japanese military and propaganda had long painted the enemy as brutal, dehumanizing captives through stories of torture, starvation, and unimaginable horrors. The women, including the nurse, had been taught that surrendering to the Americans would result in unimaginable humiliation, worse than death. Yet, the reality she faced in the camp contradicted everything they had been taught. Instead of being subjected to violence and degradation, the nurse and the other prisoners were treated with a care and dignity that they had never known in the harsh environment of wartime Japan. American medics and soldiers, bound by the Geneva Convention, offered them food, medical treatment, and protection. The very acts that were supposed to prove their degradation, being fed, receiving medical aid, and treated as human beings, seemed like small miracles to women who had never experienced such compassion. For the first time, the nurse found herself questioning everything she had ever known about the enemy. The American soldiers did not mock or abuse them, but treated them like people. And this humanizing treatment opened her eyes to the vast difference between what she had been told to expect and what she was actually experiencing. The realization was staggering. The enemy, far from being cruel, were acting with a humanity that was completely unexpected. The nurse's mind began to unravel the lie that had been taught to her, and all those who fought in the war. Americans were not monsters. They were human beings who, despite being at war, acted with compassion and empathy. This clash of expectation and reality began to plant seeds of doubt in her and the other women's minds. If the Americans were capable of such kindness, then what else had they been lied to about? The very foundation of their beliefs was beginning to shift, and in its place was a new understanding of war, humanity, and the true meaning of honor. As the nurse settled into life within the American camp, she continued to witness small but profoundly impactful acts of kindness that slowly began to change her perspective. These gestures, simple as they may seem, were a direct challenge to everything she had been taught about the enemy. For the first time, the nurse and the other women began to experience the comforts of life that had once been reserved for the privileged, or those not caught in the throes of war. The most immediate and noticeable act of kindness was the food. The women were offered hearty, nourishing meals, hot soups, bread, and even meat. These were foods the women had not seen in months, perhaps even years, as they had lived through the hardships of a war-torn environment where food was scarce and often rationed to the point of starvation. To be given food in such abundance was not just a physical comfort, but also a psychological revelation. The nurse found herself trembling, not only from hunger, but from disbelief. The warmth of the stew was more than nourishment. It was proof that the enemy saw them as human beings. As time passed, the kindness extended beyond food. The women were given clean uniforms, their wounds were treated with care, and they were given small comforts such as blankets and beds, luxuries they had not experienced in the brutal conditions of wartime Japan. These simple acts, so ordinary to the Americans, were foreign and overwhelming to the prisoners. The nurse's mind began to process that her captors were not the heartless monsters she had been taught to expect. Instead, they were people who, despite the horrors of war, still saw the value in treating others with dignity. These acts of kindness also began to affect the women emotionally. Some women, who had been taught to reject such kindness as a form of trickery or weakness, began to let go of their skepticism. Others found it so difficult to accept that they hesitated, refusing food at first, convinced it must be poisoned. Yet slowly, as each act of care continued, the walls of distrust began to fall. The women's resolve to resist the kindness slowly began to weaken, replaced by the realization that perhaps the most unexpected and powerful force in war was not cruelty, but compassion. As days passed in captivity, the nurse and the other women began to form a tentative trust with their American captors. The initial skepticism and fear that accompanied their capture slowly gave way to a more complex understanding. While the nurse had initially hesitated to accept any kindness, believing it might be part of some cruel trick, she now found herself caught in an uncomfortable yet undeniable shift. The food, the medical care, and the basic comforts offered to them were not just random acts, but symbols of respect and humanity. One of the most significant moments in this developing trust was when the nurse was offered a pencil and paper. The idea of being allowed to write home was nearly as shocking as the kindness they had already received. Throughout the war, prisoners had been forbidden from communicating freely, and any attempt to do so was punished severely. Yet, here, the American guards were offering the women a chance to write letters without restriction. To the nurse, this act was almost incomprehensible. She had been taught that the enemy would never allow them such freedom. Communication would be tightly controlled, and the Japanese government would likely block any correspondence to prevent dissent or morale loss. Yet here was a blank sheet of paper, an invitation to express herself and connect with her family. Her hesitation was palpable as she stared at the empty page for a long time. Eventually, she began writing, starting with the simplest of messages. "Mother, I am alive. They feed me. They treat me kindly." This letter would later be intercepted by Japanese intelligence, but its content would deeply trouble those who read it. How could this be? How could a Japanese soldier write to her family and say that her captors were treating her with kindness? This simple letter, the first of many, would mark the beginning of a shift not only in the nurse's mind, but in the collective consciousness of the women in the camp. The increasing trust between the prisoners and their captors, fostered through small gestures of respect and dignity, became a quiet revolution within the camp. The women were not just surviving, they were being treated with compassion and afforded a new sense of value. As the nurse realized, these small acts of care had a lasting power that far exceeded the immediate physical comfort they provided. They were breaking down the psychological barriers that had been built up by years of war, propaganda, and indoctrination. Slowly, the women began to see themselves not as mere tools of war, but as human beings worthy of respect. As the days in captivity stretched on, the young nurse and the other women began to experience profound cultural and psychological transformations. Raised in a system that revered suffering and demanded absolute loyalty to the emperor, the women had been taught that their individual worth was tied to their ability to endure pain and sacrifice for the greater good. Their identity had been shaped by the ideals of Bushido, the warrior code that prized loyalty, honor, and death over dishonor. For these women, their lives had been dedicated to service, whether as nurses, soldiers, or auxiliaries, with little regard for personal comfort or happiness. Now, in the American camp, they were being confronted with a radical new reality. Simple things, such as a warm meal, a soft bed, or a moment of kindness from a guard, began to challenge the very core of their beliefs. In this strange new world, dignity was no longer tied to suffering. The women were slowly beginning to understand that their lives had value beyond their ability to endure hardship. Each day, as they were treated with respect and offered the comforts they had once been denied, the walls they had built around themselves started to crumble. For the nurse, this realization was particularly jarring. She had been trained to believe that honor meant enduring suffering in silence, that personal pain was an essential part of devotion to her country and emperor. The warmth of the stew, the tenderness with which the American medic had tended her wound, and the sense of safety and care she now experienced all stood in stark contrast to the brutal world she had known. Slowly, these experiences began to erode her sense of self-worth, built upon the idea that only suffering could earn honor. The nurse also began to reflect on the way she had viewed her captors. Initially, she had seen the Americans as faceless enemies, driven only by the desire to destroy Japan and her people. Yet, the kindness she encountered forced her to question this assumption. The Americans, far from being heartless invaders, seemed to be motivated by principles of decency and humanity. This transformation was not just intellectual, it was deeply emotional. The nurse found herself not just questioning her beliefs, but reinterpreting the meaning of honor, dignity, and the value of life itself. These small, subtle changes were taking place not only within the nurse, but across the entire group of women in the camp. As they began to experience kindness instead of cruelty, their sense of identity and purpose shifted. Some began to speak openly about their doubts, expressing confusion over the ideas they had long held sacred. Others began to find new ways to connect with one another, forging bonds that transcended nationality and past allegiances. In this strange new world, they discovered that their worth was not measured by their capacity to endure suffering, but by their humanity. The camp, once a place of captivity, began to feel more like a space of quiet revelation, where dignity could be reclaimed, and where the true value of life was realized not in the context of war, but in the context of human compassion. This psychological transformation was not easy, and the women often wrestled with guilt, shame, and confusion. Yet, it was this transformation that would ultimately shape their understanding of the war, their captors, and, most importantly, themselves. As the days wore on in captivity, the nurse and the other women began to experience profound personal transformations. For many, this shift was a gradual process, marked by small moments of realization that challenged their previously held beliefs about loyalty, honor, and sacrifice. Raised in a culture where individual comfort and needs were secondary to duty and collective suffering, the women had been conditioned to endure hardship without complaint. The idea of being treated as individuals with inherent worth, rather than just tools for the war effort, was foreign and unsettling at first. One of the most striking transformations was the newfound sense of personal agency and worth that began to emerge among the prisoners. Simple things, like receiving personal care, having a bed to sleep in, and being given time to rest, began to alter how they viewed themselves. The nurse, who had once believed her value was tied solely to her service and ability to endure pain, began to realize that she had intrinsic worth beyond her utility to the empire. For the first time in a long while, she felt as though she mattered as a person. Education became another significant area of transformation. The women were offered the opportunity to learn, something that had been denied to them in their previous lives. The nurse, who had once been focused solely on her role as a soldier and caregiver, found herself in a classroom for the first time in her life. She was handed a piece of chalk and asked to trace English letters on a board. The act of learning for her own sake, rather than out of obligation or duty, was a revelation. It was an experience that allowed her to reconnect with her own sense of identity, separate from her role in the war. As the women began to question the foundations of their training, some started to engage in deep reflection about their place in the world. Many began to write letters to their families, expressing not just their survival, but their sense of confusion and disbelief. They were being treated with kindness and dignity by the very people they had been taught to fear and hate. For the nurse, writing home was a form of catharsis, a way to process the shock and the shifting realities of her life. The small acts of kindness from the Americans, the food, the medical care, the time for rest and recreation, served as a catalyst for deeper, more profound changes. The nurse found herself starting to see the world differently. The walls she had built around herself began to crumble, and with them, the rigid ideals that had once governed her sense of duty and honor. These shifts in perception did not come without struggle. Guilt and shame lingered, especially as many women wrestled with the idea that accepting care and comfort could be seen as dishonorable. Yet, over time, these feelings were replaced by a quiet understanding that dignity could be preserved even in captivity. The women's experiences of personal transformation were not uniform. Some resisted the changes, clinging to the beliefs they had been taught for so long. But for others, the kindness they encountered in captivity opened the door to a new way of thinking about themselves and the world around them. They began to understand that honor did not lie in suffering, but in being treated with respect and humanity. The nurse's personal journey was a microcosm of the broader changes taking place within the camp. She, like the others, was discovering her own value as a human being, separate from her role in the war. As the women learned to embrace their worth, they also began to embrace their individuality, something they had been taught to suppress. The kindness they received, rather than weakening their resolve, strengthened their sense of self. In this strange and unexpected place, they discovered a new form of strength. Not the strength of endurance, but the strength of compassion and self-worth. The young nurse's return to Japan after the war marked a stark contrast to the kindness and comfort she had experienced in the American camp. As she boarded the ship home, she carried with her the memories of warm meals, clean beds, and the dignity she had been given as a prisoner. These memories were now juxtaposed against the harsh reality awaiting her in a Japan devastated by war. The country she returned to was a place of hunger, destruction, and despair. Cities lay in ruins, families had been torn apart, and starvation was rampant. Her own mother was thinner than the nurse could bear to see, struggling to survive on the meager rations that were still being distributed. The images of her life in captivity stood in stark contrast to the suffering she encountered upon her return. The American camp, though a prison, had offered more humanity than the freedom she had once fought for. There, she had been fed and treated with respect. At home, her family and countrymen were suffering under a broken system. The comparison was overwhelming, leaving the nurse to grapple with her conflicting emotions. How could the very enemy that had been painted as cruel and dehumanizing offer more humanity than her own homeland? This realization was difficult to process. The values she had been raised with, the idea that suffering was a sign of loyalty and honor, seemed hollow in the face of this new truth. She had been taught to believe that to die for the emperor was the highest form of sacrifice. Yet, in captivity, she had discovered that there was another way to live, with dignity, compassion, and respect. Now, back in a country struggling to rebuild, she could not ignore the disparity between the promises of her homeland and the reality she had lived through in the camp. Her transformation was not just personal, it was political and cultural. The war, which had been sold as a fight for honor, had instead led her to question the very foundations of her country's ideology. The kindness shown by the Americans in captivity had shattered the illusion of Japanese superiority, leaving the nurse to reflect on a world where compassion and humanity were far more powerful than sacrifice and suffering. The unintended legacy of the Americans' humane treatment of prisoners was profound, not only for the nurse but for all the women who had been held in captivity. While the American forces had treated the prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, their actions went far beyond the legal requirements. They showed kindness, compassion, and dignity, qualities that left a lasting impact on the women. This treatment was not designed to be transformative, but it became a quiet revolution in the hearts and minds of the prisoners, forcing them to rethink everything they had been taught about honor, duty, and loyalty. The women, including the nurse, began to share their stories with one another. They spoke of the warmth of the food they had received, the respect shown to them by their captors, and the acts of kindness, like receiving medicine, medical care, and the opportunity to write letters home. As they exchanged their experiences, it became clear that their perceptions of the world had changed. They had been conditioned to believe that the Americans were cruel, and that death was better than capture. Yet, the reality was far different. The Americans, far from treating them as subhuman, had provided them with care, respect, and even some sense of normalcy. For the nurse, the most significant change was in her perception of herself. In the American camp, she was treated as an individual, not just a soldier or a nurse. Her value was no longer tied to her ability to endure suffering for her country. Instead, she was recognized as a human being with inherent dignity. This recognition would not easily be erased. She found herself questioning her previous notions of honor and loyalty to a system that had demanded her life and suffering without care for her well-being. The POW legacy of kindness did not end when the women were repatriated. The seeds of change planted during their captivity began to grow as the women returned to Japan. Some women spoke of their experiences openly, challenging the widespread propaganda and questioning the very basis of the war. Their stories contradicted the notion that the enemy was cruel and subhuman, and in doing so, they became a quiet but powerful force for change within Japanese society. For many, the kindness they had received in captivity was not just an experience of survival, but a radical rethinking of what it meant to be human. The impact of the humane treatment the women received in the American camps extended far beyond their immediate captivity. The kindness and respect shown to the prisoners, though initially difficult to accept, led to unforeseen consequences that not only affected the women personally, but also influenced post-war Japan in profound ways. The American policy of humane treatment proved to be more effective than mere survival. It sowed the seeds of transformation, both within the women's minds and in the broader socio-political context. One of the most significant effects of this humane treatment was the breakdown of the dehumanizing propaganda that had been ingrained in the prisoners during the war. The women had been taught that surrendering was disgraceful and that the enemy would show them no mercy. Yet, in the camps, they were treated with dignity, given food, medical care, and even the chance to learn. For many, this was a direct challenge to everything they had been told. The realization that the Americans, far from being ruthless, had treated them with respect, left them questioning the beliefs they had once held as absolute truths. This shift in perception was not just personal but had broader implications for the women's relationships with their families and communities back in Japan. As they returned home, they carried with them not only the physical scars of war, but also the emotional and psychological shifts that had taken place in captivity. Some women spoke openly about the kindness they had received, challenging the narrative of American cruelty. These testimonies became powerful antidotes to the deeply entrenched ideas of enemy barbarism that had been central to Japan's wartime ideology. In Japan's post-war period, these stories of kindness and dignity played a role in reshaping country's identity. While the occupation forces focused on rebuilding Japan, the women who had experienced such transformative treatment became witnesses to a different version of the enemy. They carried with them a quiet resistance to the old myths of honor, duty, and sacrifice, promoting a new understanding of what it meant to live with dignity, even in the midst of war. The legacy of kindness shown in the American camps not only altered the women's lives but left a mark on the cultural and social fabric of a nation in the process of rebuilding itself. The quiet revolution of dignity that took place in the American camps left a lasting mark on the women who experienced it, and by extension, on post-war Japan. The kindness and respect they received from their captors, food, medical care, personal agency, and education challenged everything they had been taught about honor, loyalty, and suffering. For the first time, these women were treated as human beings with inherent worth, not just as tools for war or instruments of sacrifice. As they returned to a devastated Japan, the women carried with them the memory of a life where dignity was preserved through simple acts of kindness. They spoke of their experiences, often in private conversations, and began to challenge the pervasive myths of American cruelty that had been ingrained in Japanese society. Their stories of kindness contradicted the wartime narrative, quietly sowing seeds of change in a society struggling to rebuild. The legacy of this transformation went beyond survival. It became a recognition that human dignity could be preserved even in the harshest of circumstances, and that compassion and respect could have a more powerful impact than any weapon. The women's experiences in captivity left them forever changed, and the lessons they carried would shape their lives and, subtly, the future of their nation.